Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. More than 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, in an act of revolutionary significance, the great temples of Egypt's many gods are closing down, all except one, the Aten. This desecration was the work of a rebel pharaoh who would rule ancient Egypt for 17 tumultuous years. Then all but disappear from Egypt's historical records. Was he a true religious visionary, or merely an outcast bent on revenge? Join us as we go in search of history to examine the mysterious life of Akhenaten, Egypt's heretic king. The curious have been drawn to Egypt's ancient monuments since antiquity. Visitors scrutinize everything from the massive pyramids of Giza to the smallest scrap of a temple wall, as if searching for a reflection of modern life amid the decay of centuries past. In the mid-1800s, archaeologists working in the ruins of Thebes believed they had made such a discovery when they unearthed the first traces of a previously unknown pharaoh.
Scholars began to turn up blocks with a very curious kind of art style on them, which looked different from anything else they'd known from ancient Egypt. Gradually, the number of these blocks began to grow, and it turned out that they represented a king called Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten.
More evidence of this mysterious pharaoh surfaced on a desolate plain 190 miles south of Cairo. There, archaeologists discovered the ruins of a great city buried under 3,000 years of desert sands. They named the spot Amarna, after a Bedouin tribe that had once lived near the area.
The tombs in the hills were still very much there. Some of them been used as churches during the early Christian period in Egypt, so they were lying open. And increasingly, visitors and scholars began to notice that something pretty extraordinary was reflected in these tombs.
Visitors entering the dank Amarna tombs found scenes of the king Akhenaten tenderly playing with a child. They were shocked. A pharaoh had never been depicted in so relaxed and intimate a pose. And where were all the deities that figured so prominently in other Egyptian tombs? This pharaoh seemed to worship only one god, a curious sun disk whose long arms reached down from the heavens and gave the world radiant life. Who was this extraordinary pharaoh? Modern pundits were quick to embrace him as everything from the first monotheist to the first humanist.
One of the interesting things about Akhenaten and his whole time period, it's like a detective story. We are left with a series of small clues, broken bits of a puzzle, and nobody yet has come up with a completely coherent explanation of what happened.
Sadly, there are few clues to point us toward the real Akhenaten and the slice of Egyptian history now called the Amarna period. What we know, we must glean from the records of the times as etched into temple walls and the tombs of his forgotten city. Akhenaten was born around 1373 BC, when Egypt was at the height of her imperial glory. The introduction of chariots had revolutionized warfare, and the armies of the pharaoh forged a collection of vassal states that stretched over 2,000 miles. From modern-day Sudan to the south, up to the foothills of Turkey. Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, employed a masterful diplomacy to keep his great nation at peace.
He sat over an empire which was the largest the world had seen. It was a magnet which attracted not only taxes and tribute, but also commerce, to the extent that a proverb was going around in Amenhotep III's day that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust. So that gives you the tenor of the times.
Akhenaten was still known as the Prince Amenhotep as he grew up in his father's court in Thebes. There, the magical arts of reading and writing, as well as poetry and music, flourished, influenced in part by the presence of exotic foreign emissaries. Thebes was also the religious capital of Egypt, a nation where the service of the gods permeated everyday life.
Religion is actually a dangerous word to use in speaking about ancient Egypt, because we have an understanding of religion that's quite different from what the ancient Egyptians would have. And they were trying to explain to themselves, for example, what makes a plant grow? Their answer was there must be some kind of a force that makes this transformation, and this force was a god.
Egyptians prayed to the god Osiris for the power of life, to Hathor for love and happiness. These forces were often pictured in human forms, sometimes with the heads of animals with which they were associated. The greatest force in nature, the sun, was the manifestation of an even more powerful god, Amun. Although he was pictured as a man crowned with 2 tall plumes, Amun was believed to be the unknowable, unseen force from which all other gods emanated.
Amun-Re is not only king of the gods, in a sense he also is all the gods. He's the higher reality that binds the whole system together. You not only have a polytheistic system, you have one that has important components of monotheism already in place.
Each god had his own major temple, which housed a sacred statue of the deity. The high priest lay offerings of food and drink before it in a series of daily rituals.
Come to your body. Bring your power, your magic, and your honor to this bread which is warm. It is the king who sends me.
The priest invoked the name of the pharaoh because as king, he was believed to have a divine force within him. The pharaoh served as chief intermediary for all celestial communications.
The pharaoh had his responsibilities to the people, and particularly to the gods, who were viewed as the powers that kept the Nile Valley user-friendly for the Egyptians. So the king was expected to provide for the care and feeding of the gods.
And the temples became rich. When the temples became rich, mean the priests became rich, mean the temples could be very powerful.
The politics of religion may have influenced Prince Amenhotep as he grew up in the shadows of the gods. But little evidence exists of the prince's formative years.
It's not too surprising that an heir apparent, a crown prince, would be on the sidelines and not too much noticed before his accession, simply because most royal children are not particularly in the limelight. For that matter, you can say this is true of anybody in ancient Egypt. You enter the public eye, the public record, when you enter public life.
For Akhenaten, this apparently happened around 1358 BC, when sometime in his late teens, he was crowned king of Egypt. Egypt was enjoying an era of unparalleled peace and prosperity when her newest pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, divine ruler of Thebes, was enthroned as king. He hadn't yet adopted the name Akhenaten. He probably received this honor upon the death of his father, although some suggest he was actually a co-regent, sharing the throne with the aging Amenhotep III. This was a common practice that helped ensure the safe passage of power within the family. For the young pharaoh, the pleasures of kingship were quickly apparent, for the new ruler now had a queen. She was called Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one is come. A painted bust of her found in the ruins at Amarna suggests she was as lovely as her name implied.
Nefertiti has always fascinated people, but when you come down to it, we actually know very little about her. The only thing we do know is that she's not of royal birth because she never has the title king's daughter.
Titles were very important in the pomp of the royal court. The king's name, Amenhotep, proclaimed to the world, Amun is satisfied. Yet he seemed to be questioning the legitimacy of this powerful god.
Right from the very beginning of his reign, he is very keen on a new cult that he's designed himself that has no relationship with anything specific that's been done before.
We begin to see a god who is shown in human form with a falcon head, which is the normal form of the sun god Ra-Heretic. But when you look at the inscription, this god is called the Aten, and the Aten means the sun disk.
The king took another unexpected step when he hosted a huge jubilee called a Sed Festival. Dignitaries from far and wide attended what must have been the event of a lifetime.
Each day, Akhenaten would host a gigantic banquet for all the people who had come to the Jubilee, and probably the only time in their lives they had a good feed, you know, with wine and beer and meat and bread and all sorts of things from the royal kitchens. And the common people pray that the king celebrates many Jubilees, because they're going to benefit from it.
These celebrations normally marked the 30th year of a pharaoh's rule, yet Akhenaten had only ruled 3 years. Historians believe he was setting the stage for a daring revelation. For it was during these heady days that the pharaoh proudly unveiled a new temple complex, dedicated not to Amun, but to the Aten. Everywhere, the image of the solar disk shone down upon the rapt audience. The deity had been stripped of any human characteristics, save for the hands that reached down to the pharaoh, giving him the breath of life.
What Akhenaten did was to say that there is only one great force in the world, and that's the power of light. Light is the cause of everything. Without light, there is no life, there is nothing.
It must have been pretty much a shock, and especially the priests of the god Amun at Thebes, because they had been so powerful.
Even the decorations of the Sun Temple broke with 2,000 years of established artistic tradition.
It delights in the curved line rather than the straight line. It also delights in things that we would class as feminine costume, sheer linen garments, the outlines of female bodies.
Akhenaten's figure looks incredibly distorted. He's given this very long face atop a long neck. He has a high waist, very large hips and buttocks, and then his spindly little lower legs look as though they're almost incapable of supporting what's above.
When looking at one of the huge colossi of the pharaoh, Some 20th century scholars couldn't even determine if it was man or woman. Still others wondered if the exaggerated features had been caused by some sort of medical ailment. Modern researchers are focusing on the hereditary condition which may have afflicted President Abraham Lincoln, known as Marfan syndrome. This disorder of the body's connective tissues produces, among other things, elongated limbs and abnormalities of the eye.
We're still in the middle of the debate over this. Some have rejected this outright, but the skeletal deformities of the Marfan's patients are roughly what you see on the monuments of Akhenaten. So I think it does bear examination, because what would follow from the acceptance of this theory is rather dramatic, I think.
Some scholars suggest that Akhenaten's uncommon features made the young prince feel like an outsider, creating his burning desire to destroy the status quo.
Another explanation might be that he's trying to make this break with the past, and so producing art that clearly can't be muddled up with what's gone before.
If this new art form was evidence of Akhenaten's new religion, why had he abandoned the old ways? This question has frustrated historians for more than 100 years. Their hopes grew when archaeologists discovered that much of Akhenaten's recorded texts had been torn down with his buildings and used as filler in the monuments of later kings. In a tedious process spanning more than 3 decades, researchers managed to photograph over 67,000 bits of this historic rubble. From these, they have since pieced together more than 890 scenes. Still, precious clues remain hidden away. In 1979, Dr. Donald Redford, working with the Akhenaten Temple Foundation, found evidence of what amounted to a State of the Union address. It was buried in a monumental gate known as a pylon in the Great Temple of Amun.
Now you can climb up onto the 10th pylon and look down through the cracks, and you see marvelous reliefs on the blocks inside that have never been published and are unknown. They come from the earliest part of Akhenaten's reign. And one of them is part of a long inscription in which he's speaking to his court. And he says a very strange thing.
I know all about the gods, but they have all ceased, whether made of gold, silver, or precious stone. But my God is the uncreated creator. No man has crafted him.
It's the sun god he's talking about. He's introducing to the court his new god. But the interesting point for me is how he speaks of the old polytheism. I'm sure he was brought up in that, but now he says they've all stopped. Have ceased.
Even as he promoted this new view of the universe, Amenhotep IV still tolerated the worship of other gods. For centuries, the lives of Egyptians were measured in the timeless cycles of nature. Each day represented the rebirth of the earth and the eternal struggle between good and evil. By the 14th century BC, the Egyptians had enjoyed many years of Ma'at, or harmonious order. Now, Amenhotep IV threatened to send the empire into chaos by promoting the worship of his new god, the Aten, at the expense of the older deities.
Amun becomes nothing, and Aten now becomes important. And therefore, the priestess of the god Amun hated him, because they will stop all the wealth that they could gain from the kings of Egypt.
The temples of the other gods and cities throughout Egypt are being forced to pay a tax in support of the Aten cult. It's not very much. It doesn't seem to be extortionate, but at the same time, this is symbolic subordination to the new cult. It's symbolic humiliation.
The very presence of a sun temple dedicated to the Aten in Thebes must have angered the powerful priests of Amun. Some historians feel this is exactly what Akhenaten desired, to break the back of the religious theocracy, thus consolidating the power of the king. The unorthodox portraits of the pharaoh worshiping his new god underscored his ambition, for the only high priest in the cult of the Aten was the king himself.
The traditional way of showing the king with the deity is to have them on roughly the same scale, sort of face to face, so that you have two focal points in the scene. But now you have a god that is shown at the top of the scene, and in fact what you've done is shift the attention onto the king, away from the god, because the king is the largest central human figure in the scene.
The king's wife, Queen Nefertiti, was also given a peculiar prominence in the new art, sometimes wearing a pharaoh's crown as she offers sustenance to the sun disk.
She really has this incredible visibility that other queens have not had. We can tell that she's a special person, but the question is why? Was she involved with the change of religion, totally committed like he was?
Some historians wonder if the tensions between the royal couple and the priests of Amun reached a breaking point in the 4th year of the king's reign. The pharaoh complained of hearing words that were more evil than anything his ancestors had ever heard. Had the priests of Amun confronted their king?
I suspect that what they did eventually is tell him, in effect, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it any longer. And they expected that the king would be intimidated and would moderate his behavior, that things would go back to normal. Well, instead, he picks up his marbles and he goes off to this new site.
The pharaoh summoned his court to a barren strip of land on the east bank of the Nile, more than 3 days' journey from Thebes. Here, he declared, he would build a new capital of Egypt, and he would name it Akhenaten, Horizon of the Sun Disk.
I will make the city of the horizon of Aten, for the Aten my father is this place. Whether it be downstream or southwards or westwards or eastwards, I will not abandon this city.
It is very desolate and extremely hot. I can't imagine a place that it is worse suited to my idea of a dream city, but he chose it. And he says that it was not he that did the choosing, it was the sun god himself who chose it. Now, how he communicated to Akhenaten, I don't know, but it has been suggested that the line of the cliffs at that point looked like the hieroglyph for horizon in the Egyptian script.
Could Akhenaten, traveling down the Nile, have seen the sun rise over those hills and taken it as a directive from his god? The 7 by 3 mile stretch of desert was certainly a haven from the fractious politics of Thebes.
It doesn't have any of the mythological baggage that other sites in Egypt have. So he can basically say that this place is holy because this is the spot of what he calls the primeval occasion, the place where the sun god arose for the first time at the beginning of creation. In other words, it's the spot of the first sunrise and sunset.
In temperatures that reached as high as 115 degrees Fahrenheit, the streets of Akhenaten took shape before the pharaoh's eyes. Great palaces were built for the royal family, with a harem to house the lesser wives. The city planners designed a massive sun temple with an open roof, in order that supplicants might trace the Aten's path on its daily trek across the sky. Even tombs were begun in the centuries-old tradition of early preparation for the afterlife. In a final fanatic affirmation of his new religion, the king changed his name to Akhenaten, which meant he who is useful to the sun disk. he denounced the existence of all gods except the Aten, thus becoming the first monotheist in the recorded history of man.
He's the one that he changed for the first time the Egyptian belief. Here is a man, comes for the first time and say, no, there is no, these gods are wrong. There is one God only. That's incredible.
Throughout the Nile Valley, Akhenaten shut down temple after temple. 2,000 years of mythology was dead. The pharaoh destroyed all traces of Amun, even the plural word for gods, on monuments and official buildings. This desecration was so complete that modern Egyptologists can date an artifact based on damage that would have occurred during this violent attack.
The rapid change in the policy of confrontation would have made lots of people nervous. Some people might have been killed. It's indicative of how little we know about the Amarna period, that we just don't know who's getting hurt.
As his royal entourage made its way down the Nile to his new home, Akhenaten was taking his entire empire toward a dangerously uncertain future. Safe within the walls of his new city on the horizon, Akhenaten seemed to relish his role as high priest of the new religion. At times, he appeared at a special viewing window in a magnificent golden chariot. This was no doubt designed to invoke the image of the sun disk passing through the heavens.
One of the things about Akhenaten's religion is that he seems to be making his god, the Aten, more like a king. And he's very much stressing his own divine aspect. So he's making the king more like a god.
Akhenaten continued his persecution of the old gods. Any reference to the mythology of the past was forbidden. Without this rich artistic heritage to draw from, artisans were forced to decorate the palaces and tombs with scenes of the royal family. For the first time in history, the king and his chief wife, Nefertiti, were shown with their children in unusually relaxed settings, another hallmark of the Amarna period.
The difference between Amarna art and traditional Egyptian art is the difference between a formal portrait and a snapshot, because Amarna art shows the moment. It's trying to show how the power of light is actually making life happen.
Even the hymn Akhenaten wrote to celebrate his god resonates with a natural peace.
O living Aten, beginning of life, when thou risest in the eastern horizon of heaven, thou fillest every land with thy beauty. Though thou art afar, thy beams nourish every field, and when thou shinest, they live and grow for thee.
Akhenaten's poetry painted the picture of a humanist king in touch with the natural world. But these very qualities may have been his failing. For more than 40 years, the pharaohs had peacefully ruled the largest empire in the known world. Egypt controlled the city-states of Palestine and Syria, while treaties and royal marriages helped maintain peaceful borders with the Babylonian and Mitanni empires. Now, far to the north, a strong enemy had emerged. The Hittites, led by their brilliant king Suppiluliuma, were moving on Egypt's northern allies. The Mitannians were the first to fall to the Hittites, their king Tushratta violently murdered at enemy hands. Dispatches arrived in the city of the horizon from the northern Syrian states begging for help. But the pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. Had Akhenaten lost interest in the affairs of his nation?
The problem was that these little city-states in Syria were also jockeying among themselves for power. They kept trying to sort of beat up each other, and they were playing off the Hittites and the Egyptians against one another, and switching sides like mad. I don't think it was that Akhenaten was particularly uninterested in the empire. I just think it took a little while for the Egyptians to get their act together.
Ultimately, some of Egypt's allies sided with the enemy. The reach of the empire began to shrink. At home, Akhenaten's obsession had other disturbing consequences.
The economic condition of the country was pretty serious. The army has been allowed to run rampant. The tax department has been tax gouging the peasants for years. So you get this impression of a guy who has secluded himself, is not coming out anymore, and is not really paying too much attention to the condition of the land.
Here, the details of Akhenaten's life take another frustrating turn.
The evidence we have to go on for the Amarna years is very, very sparse. We are reduced to trying to write the history of the Amarna period from something as crass and lowly as wine jar dockets, of all things.
All we can do is try and make educated guesses, and everybody comes up with a different answer.
Most agree that by the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, the lovely Nefertiti, who had figured so prominently in the new religion, no longer served as the pharaoh's chief wife.
And we see instead a co-regent, another pharaoh, ruling with Akhenaten. There is a very strange relationship between these two kings. Loving relationship, very intimate relationship. And so Akhenaten perhaps had finally come out of the closet and discarded Nefertiti and brought his boyfriend on the throne.
Many historians accepted the provocative idea of the homosexual co-regency. The younger pharaoh was believed to be Smenkhare, a handsome son-in-law of Akhenaten. Then some scholars begin to notice a similarity between the young boy and Nefertiti herself.
We now realize, after looking at the evidence for the past 60 years since then, that in fact this new pharaoh is probably not a man at all, but is none other than Nefertiti promoted as pharaoh. So the idea that Akhenaten was homosexual kind of goes by the wayside.
Another sensational scenario haunted early students of the Amarna years, cutting to the heart of modern concepts of human decency. Akhenaten was known to have 6 daughters, and 2 of the princesses eventually had children of their own. They listed king's wife among their various titles, fueling speculation that Akhenaten had actually married his own children in a desire to produce a suitable male heir.
As Egyptologists, we have to come to terms with the fact that the Egyptians sometimes had different cultural practices from ours. We are dealing with a divine king who is trying to copy the gods, and this is something that would not be out of place in Egyptian mythology.
Still, many modern scholars feel the evidence of an incestuous marriage is far from conclusive. Such titles may have been designed to give the child greater status in the shifting politics of the royal family. In the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten disappeared from public life. It could be that he died or lost power and simply faded away.
We don't know how he died. We don't know how Nefertiti died. They could have been deposed and assassinated. They could have died naturally. They could have died by one of the plagues that periodically swept through the ancient Near East at this time. We just don't know.
The following years in the city of the horizon are shrouded in further mystery. The next pharaoh could have been the young Smenkhare, or even Nefertiti, now posing as a man. What is known is that within a few years, a young boy assumed the throne who may have been the son of Akhenaten by a lesser wife. Around 1333 BC, the newly crowned king, young Tutankhamun, faced the daunting task of reconciling the wounded factions of his divided nation. He may have been related to Akhenaten, perhaps even his son, but family loyalty didn't extend to the Aten.
You can always imagine some kind of pressure group lurking behind the scenes, perhaps the old priesthood, especially of Amun. And he had to do something. Tutankhamun moves away from Amarna relatively quickly. And I think that is the crux. Somebody realized that this city is almost under a curse. We've got to get away. And that was a signal, in a sense, that the order is changing. The old order is returning.
The royal court moved northward to Memphis, the capital of Lower Egypt. Temples reopened across the land. Farmers once again prayed to Hathor for good weather. Anubis reclaimed his place at the entrance to the underworld. The glorious city of the horizon became a ghost town. Her great palaces were destroyed, her tombs emptied.
It must have become very clear to the Egyptians that, in their view, Akhenaten had not ruled according to Ma'at. However much he claimed, he had actually subverted the correct order of the universe.
The heresy of the Aten was so reviled that a later pharaoh, Horemheb, and his successors defaced most of Akhenaten's images and struck his name from the official list of kings.
There is a genuine abandonment of the whole idea of Akhenaten. And whenever anyone has to refer to them, they do so by pejoratives, that enemy of Akhenaten or that rebel of Akhenaten, but they will not refer to him by name ever after that.
The revolutionary changes of Akhenaten and his god disappeared with time and the shifting sands.
When thou settest in the western horizon, the earth is in a darkness like the dead. Every lion cometh forth from his den. All serpents, they sting. Darkness reigns. The earth is in silence.
Atonism was completely vanished because they worshipped Aton through Akhenaten. When Akhenaten died, it's finished.
Yet with the passage of centuries, the legacy of the iconoclastic pharaoh refused to fade away. In 1907, excavators in the ancient royal necropolis outside Thebes discovered the entrance to a previously unknown tomb. Inside, the small chamber was in shambles, picked over by grave robbers during some long-forgotten raid. But they had left behind the large gilded burial shrine of Akhenaten's mother, Queen T, and a coffin. It bore the stamp of Amarna royalty, but the name of its occupant had been either cut out or erased.
The body was put away in a coffin actually designed for a royal female, probably one of the princesses, but which was reused for a male, under circumstances that we don't quite understand.
Archaeologists had hoped that this might be Akhenaten himself, but subsequent tests revealed that the mummy's age at death was around 25 years old, too young to be the rebel king. The coffin is just one more unsolved clue in the enigma of this pharaoh.
I rather think that if Akhenaten had made the Aten into the one that contains the many instead of the one that excludes the other gods, he might have been more successful, but he moved too fast and too radically.
We may never know what really happened at Amarna, but perhaps this is the essence of Akhenaten's attraction, for more has been written and debated about his reign than any other Egyptian pharaoh, even King Tut.
If you look at the way people have interpreted Akhenaten and his beliefs from the time in the 19th century when he was rediscovered, he has been used as sort of as a mirror to reflect people's own views.
Nowadays, people tend to see Akhenaten in the light of our most recent experiences with charismatic leaders, not as a St. Francis of Assisi, but as an Ayatollah Khomeini, for example.
Today, of course, monotheism is triumphant everywhere, so that we have a kind of a sympathy towards an early monotheist. And I think that is one of the underlying reasons why we want to make him look like us. And we want to find a prototype of Christ or something like that in this person. That, to me, is the reason why he's so popular today. And his popularity never wanes.
The ruins of Akhenaten's dream city simmer under a blistering sun. Yet year after year, visitors return to its bleak environs. Perhaps they recognize something all too familiar among these wind-worn rocks, a bittersweet fable of the beauty and danger of new ideas. For a liberating thought, born in a burst of idealism, will crumble to dust in the smothering grip of repression. It's a truth we see echoed time and time again in the chronicles of man, whenever we go in search of history.